Hey everyone, I am going to go over an example of a food web and how to read it and how to identify different things within the food web. So this is one I found. It includes a man, polar bears. This word here is called kittiwake. I'll talk about it in a sec. It's a type of seagull. There's some Arctic foxes, brown bears, lemmings, grasses, caribou. So we're presuming that it's some sort of maybe tundra or colder climate food web. And there's a lot of arrows going around all over the place here. So let's look at how we can read it. Remembering that if we have an arrow, that means the energy is moving from one organism or animal to another. So in this case, the grasses are being eaten by the lemmings, okay? Not the other way around. So the caribou moss would be eaten by the caribou, and then the Arctic wolf might be eaten by the caribou, okay? So the arrows indicate what is being eaten by what. So altogether, this is called a web. You can see it's why it's called a web. Think of a spider web. There's all kinds of branches all over the place, and it's more spread out. But we all also have individual chains, and those are kind of like one-way paths from one organism to another organism. So say an example of a food chain within this food web. Say if we start with the lichen, go up to the Arctic hares, then follow this pathway to our snowy owls, and then up to man. That would be considered one individual food chain within the food web. So another thing we've talked about in lessons is our trophic levels. So you see on the side here we have a first trophic level, secondary trophic level, third trophic level. These refer to kind of like the steps in energy that is transferred between organisms when they get eaten. Or you can just think of the steps that are taken between organisms that are consumed. So you can think of everything in below this green line would be considered our first trophic level. And then if we step up to our next row, might be able to think of them like rows in some instances. Everything in here, in this case it's green, would be our second trophic level. Moving up to this next kind of row, we have our third trophic level. Notice here how we have some different colors. We have brown bears and Arctic foxes, and the web kind of continues on beyond Arctic foxes. That is okay. Brown bears in this case are considered a primary or a top carnivore that I'll talk about in a sec, but they consider them in the third trophic level because they are 3 steps above that first trophic level. And continuing so on and so forth, we have the fourth trophic level and fifth trophic level. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete those real quick. Kind of clear it up before I move on. So you could say the caribou moss is in the first trophic level. The musk ox would be in the second trophic level. The snowy owls are in the fourth trophic level. Also the kittiwakes, they're called. A kittiwake, here I have a picture of it. It's like a seagull. I think it's a British term, or they found in Europe. It looks kind of cuter than a regular seagull, but nonetheless, this is what a kittiwake is. Oh, the other weird name we have on here, the picas. I think they're pronounced picas. It looks like that. It's like a small mountain rodent found in North America, parts of Asia. So those are 2 animals that are on our food web. So we've talked about the food web. We've talked about trophic levels. We can also think about, okay, what are plants and what are animals in this case to identify herbivores and carnivores. Anything on this food web that is in yellow, we call that a producer because they are autotrophs and they are producing their own food. So things like grasses, moss, liverworts, lichens, these are all producing their own food from sunlight. So we call these producers, and they would all be in the first trophic level. We also have red, which is the top carnivores. In the case of the top carnivore, they cannot be eaten by anything else. So brown bears, they can't be consumed by anything else. I guess maybe man could consume brown bears in some cases. Over here, you could maybe consider, okay, if man eats Arctic wolves, man is, in most food chains, if man is included, they're always going to be the top carnivore. If they were not included, though, in many instances, the Arctic wolves and the brown bear would be considered a top carnivore. Okay, so red is top carnivore. In this case, too, we also have green as our primary consumers because they are the first level in eating the producers. So we have Arctic hares, lemmings, caribou, and musk ox, and the pikas. Those are all examples of primary consumers. Last thing we want to talk about is your secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. That can be a little tricky because it's not always straightforward. You have to look at your individual food web. So say if I want to look at, let's pick the brown bear. So we're going to look at our brown bear here. To find out whether brown bear could be considered a primary, secondary, tertiary consumer, we have to look at the chain that it takes to get to the brown bear. So we say if we start with our lichen, that would be our producer. We go up to our lemmings. These would be our primary consumer. And if we're considering just this purple food chain, the brown bears would be considered our secondary consumer because our lichens would be considered our producer. Lemmings would be our primary consumer. Brown bears would be our secondary consumer. Okay. In some cases, though, you can get a little tricky. Consider the kittiwakes. So if we were to look at the different food chains that go up to the kittiwakes, say if we started from the lichens, that'd be our producer. Our Arctic hares would be our primary consumer. Remember, primary means first. Going up to our kittiwakes, that would be our secondary consumer if we are looking at this specific food chain. So a kittiwake could be considered a secondary consumer. However, say if we went from the lichen, we followed this food chain up to our lemmings, there would be our primary consumer, up to our Arctic foxes. These would be our secondary consumers, our Arctic foxes, and then up to the kittiwakes, that would be our tertiary consumer. So our kittiwakes in this food chain could be considered both the primary consumer, they could be both considered the secondary consumer if we went through this food chain, and we could also consider them the tertiary consumer if we went through this food chain. So watch out for that. It can be a little tricky sometimes. There might be more than one answer. But that's generally how we list primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Quaternary consumers just means 4, so you're going up one more level. So in that case, if we follow this food chain through, lichens would be producer, primary, lemmings, secondary, tertiary, and man would be our quaternary consumer up here. Okay, so that's a little insight on how to read a